Hello and welcome everyone. We're just going to wait a few more minutes to allow more people to join us. I think we'll wait one more minute and then we'll start. Okay, so I think I'm going to start now the session and start by welcoming you all to this Inclusive Space seminar series here at the Bartlett, which is the Faculty of the Built Environment at UCL. So today you've joined the October edition of Inclusive Spaces, which coincides with Black History Month. And indeed, today's session is specifically taking as an entry point the experience of Black and minoritized young adults in England to explore the impact of COVID-19 and associated lockdown measures. So my name is Barbara Lipietz. I'm Associate Professor at the DPU at the Bartlett, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to the collaborative project entitled Navigating Space Under Lockdown. I'll be introducing you to this project with the help of my DPU colleagues, Jordana Romano and Danielle Oviedo, and also the help of Tyler Hinkson and Nazra Iqbal, who are two of the participant peer researchers on the project. You'll be introduced to what that term means shortly. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping points to make. So the session is a recorded session and it will be added to the faculty YouTube channel, Bartlett EDI website, and also forwarded to all the attendees of this seminar. We encourage you to submit questions for the speakers at any point during the session, and you can do that by clicking on the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Of course, you can also put your own question, but upvote that of others. And the session will close at 2 p.m. sharp. So we're going to go to the next slide, please. Danielle is helping me with the slide. And the next slide too. Just want to give you a sense of the rationale for the project. Daniel, if you don't mind coming to the next slide. Thank you. The collaborative project really came out of an observation 4 to 5 months into the pandemic, which was that on the one hand, there was a large and growing body of evidence of that Black and minoritized communities in the UK were being disproportionately affected by the health and broader socioeconomic impacts of COVID-19 pandemic and the associated policy responses, which, as you remember, were lockdown, social and physical distancing, etc. But on the other hand, there was a relative silence regarding the specific impact or the specific experiences and needs of young Black and minoritized adults in this context. And by young, I know it's a disputed term in different parts of the world, but here we chose to use the 18 to 35-year group. This silence, of course, echoed the relative invisibility of this demographic in public discourses and policy more generally. And so to try and fill this evidence gap, the team at DPU initiated a pilot research project with our long-term partners, the Ubele Initiative. Ubele Initiative is an African diaspora-led intergenerational social enterprise that was set up with the purpose of building more sustainable communities across the UK. And Ubele Initiative has been a strong voice for Black and minoritized groups in England during the pandemic. And so I really warmly invite you to have a look at their work on the website. And it explains why nobody from Ubele is with us today, because they're either discussing at workshops or actually receiving an award as we speak. But they're very much with us in spirit. So we also teamed up with Foam 20, which is a multimedia community focused organization, to support the mixed methods approach that we thought was really necessary for such a project, and that Jordana is going to outline for you. And all of this was financed through the National Lottery Community Support Fund grant. So I'll now pass on to Jordana, who's going to be explaining the different methods we use for the research. Danielle also will then talk through a little bit some of the findings from one of the research methods that's called Maptionnaire. We'll also have a quick look at the first minutes of a film that was co-produced with the team. I'll talk you through some of the key findings of the report, and then we'll have Nasser and Tyler explaining their perspective on the whole project experience and key findings. So Jordana, to you.
Thank you, Barbara. So yeah, about the methods, we decided to use a mix of quantitative and qualitative research methods that would enable us to engage with a diverse group of respondents from across the country and really capture the nuances and complexities of people's experiences of lockdown more accurately. So early on in the research process, we recruited a group of 12 peer research volunteers to help us ensure that our focus and methods were accessible, meaningful, and relevant to the demographic that we were trying to reach. And we invited these individuals alongside a wider group of young adults from within Ubele's network to participate in some exploratory focus groups, which were looking at the impact of the pandemic and related lockdowns on mental health and well-being, housing, relationships and connectivity, and mobility, space, and income. And we collectively analyzed these discussions to pull out the common issues and experiences that we felt could be explored at scale using an online survey tool called Maptionnaire, which Danielle will speak to you about in a little bit more detail shortly. And while we led on, by we I mean the DP research team, we kind of led with our 12 peer research volunteers on the focus group discussion and survey aspect of the research. Our partners from Ubele and Foam 20 led on the development and production of a podcast series exploring the themes of education and employment, mental health, positive experiences of lockdown, and relationships. And they also produced a short film featuring creative content and video footage from the volunteer peer researchers themselves. And as Barbara mentioned, we'll show you a little bit of that shortly. So this mixed method approach provided respondents with a variety of platforms through which they could express themselves and engage with the research according to their interests and preferred ways of communicating. And each method also produced a really distinct set of data and insights into the complex, subtle, and at times contradictory impacts of the pandemic on this group. So the survey, I just want to speak through each of these, to give you a sense of that richness of data that came through. And the survey really enabled us to reach a much larger sample group of respondents than we would have been able to kind of meet face-to-face or in focus group discussions. And this provided us with a sense of scale and also a grasp of the commonality and spatiality of the issues. And the spatial dimension Danielle can speak to in a bit more detail shortly. The focus group discussions and podcasts, as well as the film that was produced, so this is the qualitative side of the research, allowed us to really hone in on the more detailed personal accounts of respondents' individual experiences, which shed light not only on the key issues that were arising from the pandemic for these individuals, but almost more crucially on the complex ways in which these issues were interconnected and at times compounded or reinforced one another. Now, needless to say, the contributions from the group of peer researchers were absolutely invaluable in the whole process, and particularly in ensuring that the research focus and methods were relevant, accessible, and appropriate, as well as engaging. I think that this work is incredibly engaging, and I hope you do check out the website after this talk. But it's also important to note that the volunteer peer research group and survey respondents are not fully representative of the young BAME, so to speak, adult population living in England. And indeed, this introduces a number of biases that I think are important to consider when thinking through the data that we collected in the survey and through the qualitative approaches. And in particular, I just want to highlight that all of the peer researchers and the majority of focus group discussion participants had completed or were enrolled in some form of higher education. And even though participants certainly took care to reflect beyond their personal circumstances and adopt a community lens in the focus group discussions, their experiences can't be taken to reflect the experiences of young racially minoritized adults in England more generally. So that's an important caveat. It's also interesting to note that 71% of survey respondents were female, and the majority of all respondents, regardless of gender, were under 30. They were single and in full-time employment or studying at the time that they completed the survey. So please just bear those demographic details in mind. And I'm now going to hand over to Danielle, who's going to tell you a little bit more about what we found from the survey.
Thanks, Jordana. So I'm going to walk you through some of the findings of our Maptionnaire survey. And just for context, Maptionnaire is an online participatory GIS tool that allows us to collect what is called geo-questionnaires, basically a common survey, but with a whole set of geographical information connected to it. And before I move further with our findings, I wanted also to acknowledge that this would haven't been possible, the analysis that I'm going to show you, without the help of our PhD student and research assistant, Orlando Sawagal from the DPU, who has been working actively with, especially with the quantitative and spatial part of the data of the project. So Jordana already gave you a quick overview of what's the composition of our sample in the survey. And we can see here, I have highlighted in green and in red are sort of the tails. So where do we have in green the most representation, and we have in red the list in different categories from ethnic background to the main occupation. Jordana has also walked you already to the main biases, but it's important as well to have that geographic location was also another bias. So we had a larger concentration in cities like Greater London, Leicester, Brighton, and Greater Manchester. And also it's interesting to note that for the age group in our respondents, we will have some specific contextual issues that will explain part of the findings. Now, just to get directly into the mix, something that was very important was this idea of identity and what the BAME acronym represents. And actually, when we look at the responses from our participants, they experience COVID-19 and its various impacts as a catalyst for rethinking about the limitations of this acronym and a call for self-identification. So actually, we included in our survey a space for open identification of your ethnic identity. And we found here you have like the summary of the word cloud, but some accurate terms and depictions such as racialized communities, communities experiencing racism, or racially marginalized communities were some of the most relevant findings on this part of our methods. Now, in terms of, we had different sections. I'm going to walk you through each of them. The first one is home and housing. And what we found is that almost 40% of our respondents had to change accommodation at least once since March 2020. And 4% of the survey sample reported having bought their first home. So we have sort of a majority of our respondents were actually in renting. accommodation in houses that for a lockdown condition is relatively highly occupied. So the average occupation in the accommodation of respondents was 3.7 people. And 57% actually reported renting their accommodation at the time of the survey, and 16% of them reported doing so in shared accommodation. So we can start having an image of what were the conditions in which people were living at the time of the imposed lockdowns. Then when we talk about work, which is another important section of our survey, 79% of our respondents actually have been furloughed at least once since March 2020. And 49% of them had changed their main occupation since the same date. If we see here this distribution of whether our respondents changed their occupation, and we have that a majority of them had at least once, but also there's 12% that more than once had to change their accommodation. When we look a bit further into these findings, the changes suggest 4 frequent situations. The first one is retraining and acquiring new skills. So we had around 9% of the survey sample that were in this situation, having to change jobs or being moved to part-time employment. We also had around 10% of the sample that were subject to redundancies without finding new employment. And then we had the change in occupation from students that were completing their degrees. So in this situation, those that responded positively, 11% of the survey sample, moved either into self-employment or freelancing. Now, in terms of work, something that is important, and here I'm starting to make the connection also with well-being and mental health, is 60% of them reported working from home at the time of responding to the survey, and 46% of our respondents were dissatisfied with their work-life balance since March 2020. And here you can see a bit more detail about that distribution. We see that the majority of our respondents were working from home, and that for them, it had become, easier for those that had access to technology, but of course, there is a considerable share of the respondents that started having more and more difficulties because of the limitations for moving locally in the city, and other restrictions, for example, not having the adequate technology or the access to internet with enough quality and bandwidth to actually conduct their activities properly. Now, in terms of connectivity and access, something else that we're finding is how easy or how difficult was for people to access different essential services. And you can see here in this chart from work to community spaces, and that there is 1 and 2 represent the levels of dissatisfaction. And actually community spaces become one of the areas where people is the most dissatisfied of in terms of since March 2020, accessing those facilities, followed by markets and healthcare. So those were sort of the 3 areas where the majority of our respondents were suggesting that they were dissatisfied with their level of access. Something else that sort of plays a role here is the internet, and for example, in terms of connections and social interactions, social media plays a significant role, and it was described both as a source of support and of anxiety. So 57% of our sample reported that their level of engagement with social media was either high or very high at the time of responding. And actually this had further ramifications that we can probably unpack from the qualitative side of the research. Now, in terms of mental health and well-being, and here I'm going to take a bit more time. Here we have a chart that, in my opinion, says a lot in terms of what was the effect of COVID-19 and the lockdown measures in terms of people's sleep, mental health, and relationships. And we can see that for mental health, there is negatively and very negatively, we have almost 70% of our respondents are perceiving such a level of negative effect. And then we have, following the sleep, 50%, and then relationships, 45% more or less of our respondents were perceiving a negative or very negative impact of the pandemic. Now, if we move further, 37% of our respondents actually reported that their perceived depression levels were high and very high, and 54% of our respondents also reporting that their perceived levels of isolation were high and very high. So this starts talking specifically about sort of the impact of the pandemic on the mental health and well-being of our respondents. Now, there is something else that is important that we consider here, and is that the pandemic also had huge economic impacts on the population, and depending on whether you were working remotely or not, there was also a correlation with the levels of mental health and well-being. So here we have a small correlations table, which I'm not going to explain that much in detail, just to say that for those that perceive the economic impact to be negative, neutral, positive, we have different effects. So the higher the number, the more negative the effect we have. And mental health tends to be the highest. So those that perceived actually a more negative effect of the pandemic on their economy also are reporting the highest scores of negative impact on mental health. And same, those that were working from home as well were reporting the highest negative impact on mental health. Overall, we have that in quite a few of our indicators, we had scores over 3, which suggest a more negative in average effect. And overall, this is what we're trying to capture here, is that respondents perceive negative effects of lockdown on their household economy actually were affected across the board: living conditions, mental health, sleep, and relationships. But those working from home actually were suffering more, at least psychologically, if their impact on their economy was not as big, which was another correlation that we ran. Now, in terms of accessing support for mental health, so we have that 27% of our sample hadn't accessed support but wanted to. And then we had 30% that actually had access to. And here we have a 41% from whom we don't know if they had access it before or not. I mean, there are a lot of open questions that, considering the nature of a pilot study that we had for our research, is important to continue exploring in further research. So many respondents noted difficulties in accessing mental health, partly because the provision is limited, especially in some neighborhoods, and also because it is costly, either in time or financially, to actually afford this type of support. However, a positive side of the pandemic is that there is a new public legitimacy of the discussion around mental health in young adults, and that's something that we feel should be addressed here. Now, I'm going to try to share a little excerpt from our video, which you can actually look at in detail. It's an 18-minute video that we have available in our website, and we're going to share the link at the end of the presentation.
I call it stress lag. Not slack, it's kind of affects people mentally.
This year I've been working with young people throughout the entirety of England, asking how the pandemic has affected them. UCL and the Ubele initiative teamed up and, using sources like Maptionnaire, asked questions about people's employment, mental health, financial status and education. We wanted to target the 18 to 35-year-old demographic because we feel like their voices are unheard. Following the stories of these young people, we can see how inspirational they are when navigating space through a global pandemic.
The entire year indoors, and it really had me just thinking and reflecting about life. My community has changed so much. The area of Elephant and Castle has changed a lot. The shopping centre is gone, it's closed, and a lot of the small businesses have moved where the new builds are, and everything just feels really different in the area. And to me, it's quite saddening because it feels like the community is changing, yet it doesn't feel like there's any physical community because we've all been isolating at home, and each time I go outside I feel somewhat like a stranger.
I was working a full-time job, like a great job that I loved, in higher education at the time. You know, I was somewhat happily married, kind of living the suburban dream, and having all of that time for introspection and really having to sit and reckon with yourself and deal with who you are. It's a very difficult journey, but it's very, very empowering and eye-opening.
how it's affected me, like this whole situation, this whole pandemic. It's just like, obviously you've got certain family members who come from older background or who are very like paranoid about the situation. So I haven't been able to spend a lot of time with them. I haven't been able to see them as usual or as normal, as frequent or as freely.
But I think I miss them more.
I'm going to stop there, but you're more than welcome to watch the rest of the video, which has many of these very interesting and moving and informing testimonials from our young participants. And now I'm going to hand over to Barbara so she can give us a bit of a rounded up summary of our findings.
Thanks very much, Danielle. It would help if I had the microphone on. So yes, so key findings. So again, these are findings that come from the research in the focus groups, from the Maptionnaire, from the podcast, from the films. And this is sort of trying to round everything together. Maybe the key central finding from our research, and unsurprising no doubt, is the centrality of home and housing conditions in shaping the impacts of COVID-19 on young Black and minoritized adults in England. And it's not a surprise, given the main government response to COVID-19 during the time of the research project was in the form of lockdown and the incentive to stay at home. So I'm going to break down this statement for you a little bit. The first point that we found from this collective research was that who young people live with, how much space they have access to, the housing density, or indeed cost consideration, all of these different aspects have had significant impact on young people's ability to work, including their ability to work from home, their work prospects, and their economic security. Secondly, the housing conditions have also had a major impact on young adults' mental health and well-being. So for some, it was a source of comfort and a shield from isolation. But for others, it was really a major point of stress, of anxiety, of insecurity, especially for those living in high-density household or in shared accommodation, where they hadn't necessarily been able to choose who they were sharing with ahead of lockdown. Many reported feeling unsafe or unable to be themselves in their own homes, or having to hide aspects of themselves. So effectively, what our research did was to highlight, or possibly more precisely highlight again, the very close interconnection between mental health, housing, and work situations. What we saw was that the loss of physical connectivity and access in the context of these several periods of lockdown have really intensified this link. And as Danielle pointed out earlier, in this context, social media was described both as a source of support and of anxiety. I won't go too much more on the mental health dimension, because Danielle pointed to many of the issues when discussing the findings from Maptionnaire. Now, another really important finding from the project was how much COVID-19 and lockdown experiences have played an indirect role in sharpening identity awareness for many young so-called BAME adults in England. So the word cloud that Danielle showed to you came very much from that reflection of that was sharpened during the COVID lockdowns. So one of the things that we picked up from some of the qualitative methods, in particular in the focus groups and in the workshop, was the impact of the intersection of COVID-19 with the Black Lives Matter protest in the wake of George Floyd's murder. Many participants in the research mentioned how they became acutely aware of the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on minoritized groups and the injustices that this represent. Generally, and in particular, and you'll see some of it is reflected also in the film, this was noted because of the high presence of Black and minoritized groups in essential services or in the gig economy. For some respondents too, this coincided with a heightened sense of disenchantment with the state and the mainstream institutional landscape, whose COVID-19 responses left many racialized minorities, they felt, off the map. So in a nutshell, the Navigating Space in Lockdown project has really highlighted the deep differentiated impact of the pandemic on young Black and minoritized adults in England. The research pointed to the vulnerability of many in this demographic, marked by precarity in housing and employment conditions. COVID-19 and prolonged lockdowns have essentially compounded these and broader experiences of disadvantage and exclusion. However, the research also highlighted the remarkable resilience and adaptability of young minoritized adults, aided by technological know-how and in many cases by social media, in what have been unprecedented and often quite traumatic times. In such context, what appeared evident is that so-called BAME community networks have been critical pillars for young adults and their networks, filling in gaps left by government in access to essential goods and services and support. And so a really important question that emerged from this research is how far and how long can such networks, often most affected by the pandemic, and yet with limited resources, continue to pick up the slack? And so on that note, I'd like to pass on to Nasser, who was one of our researchers during the project. Nasser.
Hi, good afternoon. So can everyone hear me?
We can hear you, Nasser. We just can't see you.
All right.
There we go. Perfect.
So from my perspective, I think it was a real great opportunity working with the university and the UBELE initiative, where it was a co-design project, where we was able to help put the survey and the questions together and to reach out to our networks. I know this was a pilot, and we're hoping that this will be the start or the catalyst of other things to come hopefully soon. I think on reflection, I think the time was quite short, so I think we could have reached a lot more young people, and I think that's mainly due to funding constraints and the way the project was set out. But it was a great opportunity, and it's quite empowering to be with peers who have a desire to make a difference in their communities, and also to continue that. And this is the first kind of peer research I've been involved in, and the university were very supportive in the process in ensuring that the right questions, we were able to ask the right questions to ensure that we'll be able to impact policy in the long term. So yeah, so from my perspective, great opportunity. If I ever have opportunity in the West Midlands to do a peer research project, I would definitely recommend it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nasser. Tyler, would you, to you, please.
Oh, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. We can't see you either.
Okay.
Oh, great, perfect.
All right, yeah. Well, I found everything really informative. Managed to learn quite a lot about all different people's perspectives from like different races, different cultures, and different backgrounds. So it was an eye-opener really, because some of the issues like I experienced was different to what other people have been experiencing. So yeah, and literally it was just good to relate to other people who are going through the life experiences. And yeah, it was good to get some things off of my chest and be around people who have a similar understanding. So it's definitely something that I'd be interested in taking part in again, and I'd recommend it to anyone else. So yeah, that was a good experience.
Okay, thanks very much, Tyler. Yeah, we really certainly enjoyed working with you and with your other colleagues. It's been really actually critical for the success of the research. So thanks again for your participation. So I think now we've given you a little bit of a summary and a taste of the research. Danielle's just put the last slide here that indicates the website of the research project. So please have a look. There's some really interesting, the film is really, really interesting. There's a report there. There's the podcast series, which was also very eye-opening, which is a discussion between some of the participants in the project and the researchers. So we'd love to hear your questions now. And just noting that some of the questions were already answered in the chat. One was a question about the reason for the change in accommodation. And I put there in the response the reasons that came up from the Maptionnaire survey. But what's also interesting to see is that because of the mixed method, we had some insights from other experiences. So we can talk more to that. There was also a question why the focus on young people, and Jordana responded that was really because we felt that there was this invisibility. I can see there's a question which hasn't been answered yet, so I'm going to read it out loud, and it's from Karen Martins. What issues were further compounded? Can we get a breakdown? Issues that were pre-existent before COVID, and how will the information gathered by the project be used to address those issues as part of a wider social systemic change? That's a very good question and a very, very broad question. Does any of my colleagues want to pick up on that now?
I can step in. I can do my best to try to kind of refer back to some of Danielle's slides that spoke to the ways in which different issues get compounded. And I'd like to draw your attention, if you can remember the slide that was speaking about mental health and income, just as an example. So people whose incomes were more affected by the lockdown adversely, so if they lost their jobs, were furloughed and so on, were more likely, unsurprisingly, to express feeling depressed or encountering anxiety or other kind of mental health conditions. In relation to your question, Karen, about issues that were pre-existing before COVID, so some of our focus group respondents who had already an established relationship with the medical or healthcare kind of services, okay, the pandemic exacerbated a lot of their pre-existing health conditions in the sense that they weren't able to get the support that they had previously been getting prior to lockdowns. So it made pre-existing conditions worse. And people who had kind of worked through certain things and were in a better place found that conditions that they'd had previously were kind of coming back again because of not being able to seek the support that they had needed to because of relationship breakdowns and so on. Another compounding issue, which I think our entire research is really sits at the intersection of, is the ways in which racial discrimination, racism, structural racism, interpersonal racism compounds people's experiences under a pandemic or lockdown. And so we saw this in terms of the interactions with public services, healthcare, in the reasons I've mentioned, but also with police, and also feeling policed within one's own home. So Barbara noted, when speaking about insecurity in the home context, I think one of the most striking comments and points of discussion for me personally was a number of respondents describing how within their own home, they weren't able to be themselves. So remember that this all happened with alongside George Floyd's murder, alongside Black Lives Matter. There was a lot going on relating to race, racism, structural inequalities, discrimination in the kind of public media, right? And so people recounted feeling quite isolated from like-minded souls. And when they were living with strangers, sometimes encountering really antagonistic behavior just because of the color of their skin, or because of politics, or because someone might be reading a book on Black Lives Matter and it would prompt antagonism from people within their homes. Separate to this, but connected in the sense of people who are non-gender conforming or gender binary, or from the LGBT community and perhaps hadn't come out to housemates or to their parents if they ended up moving back home, also found it very difficult and needing to almost police themselves at home, given that they were put into a home situation that they hadn't necessarily chosen or that had been kind of changed on their behalf. So I hope that speaks to some of your question there, Karen, but happy to pick up on that. And I'm happy to touch on the question about what we want to do with this research moving forward, but I think if I can, I'd like to turn to Nasser and Tyler, because I think a fundamental part of this research and what was exciting about it is that it was co-produced, and obviously we want to build on that. But maybe Nasser and Tyler, if you could potentially comment on the bigger picture of that collaboration, what it's done for you personally, any striking issues, and how you could see us being able to meaningfully expand on this or make change.
Thank you, Jordana. And I know that this was a conversation that we had in our group as we was co-designing the research about what impact it will have. And I know the UBELE initiative sent this research out across the country to all its partners. And I'm hoping that local authorities and people in the public sector will start to pick up some of this stuff and use it to drive policy forward. There's a question here from Alan, and he says, "Do you feel anything was missed in the research?" I think it was quite important to understand that when doing surveys and questionnaires, you could just carry on asking questions and questions. I think we come and found themes together. So we all had different questions we wanted to ask. We had some themes, and then under them themes, we started to develop questions under them themes. In terms of anything that we missed, I'm not sure if we missed anything, but I think we could expand on some of the inequality stuff and some of the mental health, and I think my peers share that in the group, and I think there needs to be a focus on understanding the impact of inequalities on young people across the board, and looking at what policy change needs to happen there, and that needs to include some of the stuff around mental health, because I think that's just a massive issue. We're talking about it regularly. It's regularly in the media, but unfortunately some of the resources and some of the action hasn't been taken yet. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Nasser. Tyler, do you want to come in, Joel?
Hello, hi. Hi, yeah. The sound just cut out, so I wasn't able to hear. I had to leave and come back in, so I didn't manage to hear the question.
I can read it out for you. So the question was whether anything was missed in the research, anything that you felt could have been expanded on to give a fuller picture, and also just generally where you see kind of space for impact or moving forward productively.
Yeah, really, I don't really see, I couldn't say anything that would need any improvements. I feel that it was an open space. Everything was good, so I couldn't say anything really to improve. But going forward, I think that the best to basically able to make any impact or change is probably what I've gathered is probably more community spaces, more opportunities like this for people from different backgrounds to come together to be able to have an open talk, to be able to connect and network and make change in different ways. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Tyler. Great. We've got another question from Hani Youssef asking whether there were young Black people involved in the research process, not participants. Now, I'm not sure if I've understood correctly, but in terms of the kinds of respondent survey group, yes, we did. But in terms of young, that might, if that's where your question is alluding to, we didn't engage with anyone under the age of 18 for ethical reasons. But I think that that's an important thinking through that kind of transition period from kind of teenagerhood or adolescence into young adulthood precisely speaks to the unique challenges that affect young adults. So that's certainly an area that I think we could look at in more depth should we expand on this project moving forward. If I haven't answered your question, Hani, please restate, with a bit more details.
Can I add something there, Jordana, as well, in terms of the involvement of the peer researchers? The research was entirely co-produced from the design and the framing to actually the analysis of the information. And we had the opportunity to work with a few of the research participants, and actually we had training on Maptionnaire, and they were involved directly in the design of the survey and the delivery of the survey. So I think that's something important that sort of is part of the legacy of the research, that there were some additional questions, and so we identified skills that could be part of a second phase of the project, or even as Nasser was saying, I would like to do this type of research as well in the West Midlands. It would be fantastic to build on this, and that's part of the legacy as well of the method and the understanding, the co-production of the survey in itself. And the survey is still live. You can still find it in our Navigating Space website in case you feel identified as part of the target population and you would like to continue providing us with information. We do cuts every now and then, and we're still getting some answers after the final cut that we had for the delivery of the project.
Thanks, Danielle. There's another question about sex disaggregation in the data, which we did do, but maybe you can speak a bit more. We didn't present on it for complexity of slides, etc. But Danielle, could you speak a little bit more about the gendered disaggregation?
Yes, I mean, as Jordana said at the beginning, one of the biggest biases is that the majority of our respondents of the survey were women. So we had like female is around 70% of the sample, and therefore that's a bias that we are outright putting at the beginning of our report, and that we try to mention at the beginning. But there are some significant differences, particularly in the scores of there was one particular score of dissatisfaction with the balance of time, and I think our female participants tended to report much higher negative scores for that, as well as the impact on sleep, impact on mental health, and to some extent on relationships compared to men that participate in the survey. But given the imbalance in the sample, we tried not to bring in that, because there is a much higher representation of women over men.
Can I just add something to that? Actually, in the group of peer researchers that help us shape the questions, etc., there was more of an equilibrium there. So that attention to gender issue was quite important. But I think the point maybe that your question.
You just muted
yourself.
I
just realized that I hope you heard the beginning of what I was saying. Okay, great. So it was Usha who was asking the question. I think it points to the fact that we actually have a huge amount of data from the Maptionnaire, let alone from all the qualitative information. And we haven't, as Nasser was saying, we haven't had yet the time to make the most of that, of unpacking what we've learned from this, knowing also full well some of the limitations of the quantitative data that we got, and some of the bias in who was represented in the more qualitative world. So there's a lot that can be unpacked according to precisely gender issues or regional issues or potentially income level issues or educational background, etc., etc. So there's really a lot there, but that is the idea of the pilot research, is really to show what could potentially be done, why it's relevant, and therefore, as Nasser and Tyler indicated, why it makes sense to try and continue that, and to localize it, to get sort of local councillors, various cities to take this initiative and develop it with the community groups that they engage with. So that was really our ambition with Ubele, to try and catalyze this conversation. And on that note, I have to say, Nasser, Tyler, and their colleagues had fantastic ideas of how to bring in, communities and local authorities or other groups that matter in communities to sort of help bring this conversation, to make it more alive. Do you want maybe to say a few words on that, either Nasser or Tyler, because there was so much interesting ideas that would be wonderful to take up later on.
We had this group discussion, and a couple of things that come out from my perspective was around having policy conversations at a local level to ensure that the data has been presented to local policy officers to ensure that they'll be taking action and driving that forward. But time was of the essence at the time. However, if there are any public sector colleagues on this call, I recommend you share this information with your community teams, with public health, and use it to drive forward some of the policies or some of the initiatives that you're going to take forward in your local communities and spaces. I think it's a valuable piece of work. I think a lot of time and effort has gone into it from both our peer researchers, UBL, and the university as well.
Tyler, did you want to say? Thanks, Nasser. Did you want to say something, Tyler, also?
Yeah, so literally just even from, hello, sorry, did something, I don't know if it cut out or not, but yeah, sorry. So yeah, literally just from having discussion from people from outside of this project, and within this project, what like really we've come up with is that we need to like send out emails, contact people who working in Parliament, MPs, local communities, reaching out to people of all different ages, and literally just like starting up charities, starting up organizations, like looking where there's funding, where is what we can do, because there's more than, like there's a lot more that we can do even as a people if we put our heads together and we network and just come together really, and everybody in the community, like we just need to make it happen, and inspire people to literally make that change. Yeah.
Great. Thanks. Thanks, Tyler. Just looking at those three other questions, I mean, Hani, I think we did answer. We had we had 12 people who were working with us, including Tyler and Nasa, who are between 18 and 35, who helped shape the questions. Without them, the relevance of what we were looking for would not have been the same. So yes, they were intimately connected and helped shape the questions and the focus of the work, and in fact also helped to shape some of the methods that were developed to collect people's voices. So for instance, the podcast series very much came out of the desire of the peer researchers to continue the conversation. It was between themselves, and then they also invited people around them to sort of to contribute. So I hope that answers your question. Diana, great to see that you want to do a similar research. We'll be happy to talk with you if you want to sort of discuss further what were some of the issues that we came up with. And then quickly, I see there's a message from Jessie regarding how the peer research volunteers were recruited and whether they were compensated. So there was a call out from Ubele Initiative. Ubele has links with Black and minority groups through largely in London to start with, but throughout England. And as you can see on the back of that, we had a lot of representation for the project throughout, I mean, not obviously throughout England. There are some places where we didn't have so many responses. And then again, that's something that we'd have to work on if we have a follow-up on this, which we'd really like to have. But so the recruitment went out through the friendly groups or in the network of Ubele, if you want. And so people sent in their CVs and they were recruited on that basis. And they were compensated for their time through the Ubele. That was part of the budget from the National Lottery Grant. Is there anything we should add on that, Nasser and Tyler?
No, I think what you've just said, that was the process. So you had to apply for the process. You had an interview with the project coordinator before you took part, and there was people from different parts of the country, from different backgrounds, different races, different ethnicities, and different religions and Christianity as well. So we made the group diverse. That's why that's how this research come together, by the input of the different elements and people's experiences.
Okay, thank you very much. Do we have any other questions? I think we've answered quite a few. Is there any other sort of issues you'd like to raise with us? There's one more I can see. No, this one has been, I think we have answered, yes. In that case, I think it's going to be time for me to close the session. Thanking you all for your interest in this. As you can see from all of our answers, we certainly learned a lot from the process, and we feel that there's so much information that came out of it, so much really important points that came out of it that need to be further that need to be further investigated and discussed. And really the importance of this research is really to start conversation, to lead to action, to change in action. So we are really hoping that we'll be able to have the grant funding in order to continue doing this. So please watch this space. And we really encourage you to have a look at their website, which is now in the chat, I think. And so I'm going to close now the session, and just with a reminder that there is going to be another session as part of the Inclusive Spaces seminar series next month on the 17th of November. And the title of it is Accelerating Islamophobia and Emerging Mosquephobia. So thank you again, and see you very soon, I hope. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.